On July 26, 1953, the guerrilla forces attacked the Mankata barracks in the siege. As they were trying to bombard to take over the barracks, they would fail, but this would be the start of the Cuban Revolution. They tried to make it into the barracks, but instead they were just an annoyance to the government of Cuba. They would make it so that they were attacking them in as many ways as possible. One of the more popular ways was a car bomb. They also would throw Molotov cocktails at the government official buildings, so they would burn and make known that they were revolting.
In 1947, Fidel Castro became very passionate about social injustice. Castro joined a political party in the 1948 election to reform the corrupted government of Cuba. Castro started the revolution because Eduardo Chávez shot himself due to his failure to get Batista out of presidency. Fidel Castro was a man for and of the people, who was solely looking out for the people who didn't have anything. He was a strong man and even better leader who wanted a more democratic government for Cuba than what it had. In 1953, Fidel gave his speech, "History will absolve me." He who speaks to you hates vanity with all his being, nor are his temperament or frame of mind inclined towards courtroom poses or sensationalism of any kind. If I had to assume my own defense before this court, it is for two reasons. First, because I have been denied legal aid almost entirely, and second, only one who has been so deeply wounded, who has seen his country so forsaken and its justice trampled so, can speak at one moment like this with words that have spring from the blood of his heart and the truth of his very gut. One supposes that a lawyer has the right to speak with his defendant in private, and this right is respected throughout the world, except in the case of a Cuban prisoner of war in the hands of an incapable tyranny that abides by no code of law, be it legal. His nearly 4-hour speech talked about how he wasn't ashamed of what he had done, and that he was proud of attacking the Mankata barracks. Although his speech was the start of the revolution, he was going to spend some years behind bars.
Batista joined the army in 1921 as a young sergeant. In September of 1933, Batista organized the Sergeants' Rebellion, and he took over the Cuban government. His credibility was sealed when the U.S. ambassador to Cuba told him he was the only man in Cuba who held any form of personal authority. Batista was promoted to colonel and led the fascist-inspired corporate state. In 1939, Batista was elected president of Cuba.
From that point on, he continued to gain U.S. support and reintroduced war tax to help the U.S. pay off war efforts. In 1948, he won a seat in the Cuban Senate. On July 26, 1943, a small group led the Fidel opposed to Batista attacked on a barracks in Santiago. Batista used his 10-for-1 order. Military commanders had to shoot 10 civilians for every 1 soldier killed. 59 people were shot, though as 19 soldiers had been killed. In May 1955, Batista released Castro and the other rebels from the attack from prison. Not many years later, Batista lost support of the Cuban army, and December 31st, 1958, he had to flee Cuba for the Dominican Republic with his reputation in ruins. Fidel Castro had been imprisoned for the attacks on the Mankata barracks, but in 1955 he was released because he had made deals with the Batista government. On December 2nd, 1956, Fidel Castro had brought a boatload of 81 insurgents near the eastern city of Manzanillo. The Batista forces were mostly either killed or captured by the Fidel Castro forces.
Raul, the brother of Fidel, Che Guevara, and Fidel Castro had escaped into the Sierra Mountain range, and there would be more guerrilla attacks to come.
With Che Guevara, they had thought of this tactic called guerrilla warfare. Fidel Castro had went to Mexico, where he had met Che Guevara.
The movement had started to Fidel Castro and all his people in the Castro's revolt. He would have college students that were going and boycotting, and some of them unfortunately would like to see another day.
With all this happening in Cuba, the United States decided that they were going to not associate with the people of Cuba because all the stuff that had been happening in the past couple of years. After this countrywide strike, Batista thought it was time for him to make a strike of his own. President Batista took a stand from Fidel Castro to try to make a statement and get him not to do it. He sent 10,000 men to go against Fidel Castro's army. When he did that, he defeated Fidel Castro's army, but there was still more to come from Fidel.
On November 1st, 1958, a Cuban militant had hijacked a plane that was filled with people. They were trying to make it to Cuba because they were going to deliver guns to Fidel's brother, Raul Castro, in the eastern side of Cuba for the rebels that he had with him. But before they would get there, they would eventually run out of gas over the ocean, and they would try to crash on land, but would crash in the water, and only 6 people would live.
The Cuban government wasn't expecting what was going to happen once Fidel Castro had got to them. Then the people of Fidel Castro's army had rushed the president's base, and Batista had fled the city and left December 31st, 1958. This was the start of Castro.
Castro would then set up his government so that he could start his presidency for the people and for him. He visited the United States of America, and some people had thought he was like a hero, but then other people thought that he wouldn't be a nice or good leader. And you know, they were exactly right. In the years after Fidel Castro seized power, he soon became drunk with power.
He then chased off his partner, Che, and soon became the dictator. They had just fought to get rid of Cuba. The United States' aftermath of the Cuban Revolution changed the way they traded and even interacted with Cuba. The Cubans made advances in health and education, but were sacrificing economic efficiency to social objectives, and with Fidel Castro in power, things were going to get worse. Castro's highly personalistic dictatorship made many middle and upper class go in exile. A serious decline in productivity was offset by the Soviet subsidies. The United States tried to help Cuba, but they were looked at as a model throughout Latin America for social progress. Castro eventually created a leftist party, taking away students and intellectuals of middle class. After this act, they had the guerrilla conflict and urban terrorism. The American government funded these guerrilla forces.
Due to the Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961, Castro sought help from the Soviet Union. This led to the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, 13 days of terror that further angered America against the Castro regime. Due to the Americans' dislike of the government dictatorship in Cuba, there was an embargo placed on Cuba that still somewhat exists today. This would disable the active trade between America and Cuba. The years that followed were troubled with turmoil.
The fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, however, further isolated Cuba. Their partner was now gone and Cuba had to make changes. Castro's legacy is still unknown. Even now, Cubans in the U.S. hold animosity towards the socialist regime. And now, with Castro no longer in power, Cuba's future is uncertain. What is certain, the revolution of 1959 only further divided Cubans. It did not really help to bring any great change to the island nation.